Now that there's a relationship set up between users and tasks, in this video, we'll be heading over to the task router to add authentication to those final 4 task-related endpoints. We're going to do some together, and some will be your challenge for the video. So to kick things off, we're actually going to skip the second one, where you fetch all tasks, and we're going to start with the third one, where you fetch a task by ID. Now, we still want to do just that. I want the user to be able to fetch a task by ID, but first I'm going to make sure they're authenticated, and second, I'm going to make sure that the task they're trying to fetch was a task they actually created. To get started, as you probably expected, we're simply going to add the auth middleware into the mix, and that's going to give us an easy win. The next thing we need to do is to change how we're fetching the task down below. We're fetching it by ID. Now, we are still going to take the ID into account, but we also need to take into account the value for the owner field. I need to make sure that lines up with the authenticated user's user ID. So right here, that means we have to change how we're fetching the task. Find by ID won't let us limit by multiple fields. We can just use find one to get that done. So right here, const task equals, I'll use await with task.findOne to find a single task, and here we pass in that object where we can specify as many or as few things as we want. For example, I can filter by ID here using the shorthand since I have a variable with the same name, and I can also go ahead and filter by the owner value. And the value I'm looking for in owner is whatever stored under request.user._ID. So here I'm just using the ID of the authenticated user. So now I'll only be able to get the details of a task if I'm logged in, and the task I'm fetching is a task I've created. Now that we have this in place, we can remove the old line and we're actually done. If I'm not the owner or the ID doesn't line up, I won't get anything back, and I'll get a 404 as the return value, which is appropriate. So there's no need to say something like this task exists, but you don't own it. That's giving away more information than you probably want to. It's simply good enough to say 404 if those two things don't match up with any tasks in the database. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and test it out to make sure it works as expected. Now, for the moment, we only have one user and they have a couple of tasks. In order to make sure all of this is working, we should get a second user into the mix and have them create their own tasks, just so we can make sure that our access control is actually functional. So over in Postman, what does that really mean? It means we're going to create a second user. Over here, we have the data for the first user we've created. We can just switch this up to something else. I'll go ahead and use mike@example.com, and I will use Mike as the name up above. Then I'm going to fire that off to create the second user, and I'll automatically be logged in as them. Then all I'm going to do is revert those changes back to what they were before. So now we're logged in as that second user, and all we're going to do is create a couple of tasks for them as well. So we'll have 2 users in total, each with 2 tasks. Right here, I'll go ahead and say something specific to Mike. Let's just say Mike has something to do, and I'll go ahead and change the completed value for this over to true. I can fire that off and make sure it's created successfully, which it is down below. Then we can add another one. I'll leave completed off so it'll default to false, and right here I can say something like find a new job. I'll send that off as well to create the second task. Now let's go ahead and try to find our task by ID. I'm going to copy the ID of that task to the clipboard, and I'm going to head over to the read task endpoint. Right here, I have that showing up. All I need to do is swap out the ID up above with the ID I just copied to the clipboard, and I should now be able to fire this off successfully. I'm going to send it off, and what do I get? I get my task showing up. Now, this is testing that things are working when I'm logged in as the user and I'm fetching a task that I do own. Let's make sure that I can't fetch this task if I'm logged in as the other user. So now we're going to log in as that first user once again. Over here for login user, I have that data from earlier in the class. I'll log in as that first user, head back over to the read task request, and try to fire off the exact same request. The only thing that's changed is now I'm user 1 instead of user 2, and I'm not the one who created this. If I fire that off, what do I get? I get a 404, which is fantastic. So users can pull their tasks by ID if they created them, and you can't pull a task by ID even if you're authenticated if you were not the person who created it. So that is all we needed to change for this router right here. We added the auth middleware, and we tweaked one line of code. Now we're going to end up doing the same thing for the other routes in this file. There are 3 others, and we'll start with get tasks right here. Now, getting this done is going to be your challenge for the video, and I have some challenge comments to outline what I'd like you to do, though the process is basically identical to what we did down below. The first thing you're going to do is add authentication to the endpoint, and from there, you're going to change which tasks we return. Right now, we would end up sending back both users 4 tasks, even though each of them only have 2 associated with their account. So we want to take the authenticated user ID into account when finding the tasks we want to limit by the owner. Now, there are 2 ways to do that. We could modify the task.find call to search for the owner inside of here, or we could use the populate functionality we explored in the last video to get all of the tasks for a specific user. Either way would work. From there, test your work. Make sure that you can only see the tasks created by that specific user when firing the request off over in Postman. Pause the video, knock that out, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's go ahead and kick things off by adding authentication into the mix. So right here, we will set up the auth middleware, and from there, we'll be able to go ahead and modify the line down below. Now, there's 2 approaches you could have taken. One would be to change what we provide as the object argument. We would set up owner, and the value we'd be looking for is on request.user._ID. This would 100% get the job done. I'll also show you the alternative, which would be to do the following. Right here, I would use await with request.user. Now here, what I'm going to do is populate their tasks. So .populate, populating the tasks exactly like we did in the last video. Then we just call the function we've used before, exec populate. This would also work just as well, and then down below, we would just send back request.user.tasks. So either approach is going to get the job done as long as the endpoint works as expected, then your solution is valid. Up above, I'll remove those challenge comments and we can test things out over in Postman. I'll save the task router. Over in Postman, we can move over to the read tasks endpoint. Here, I'll fire them off while logged in as that first user, and I can see the tasks we created for them. I don't see that task about Mike, and I don't see the task about getting a new job because those were created by the second user, and I'm authenticated as the first user, so I only see the 2 tasks this one actually created. Now that that endpoint is all wrapped up, we can continue down the list. We already knocked out this one. The next one we have right here is the ability to update a task by ID, and we're going to end up working through a similar process to the other 2. Now, this one we'll work through together. Let's start by adding authentication in. And down below, we're going to go ahead and switch how things work. Right now, we are finding the task by ID, which we don't want to do. We want to find it by ID, but also by the owner value. So const task equals await. We are going to await a call to task.find1. We're going to find it by its ID. We get that value exactly where we were getting it before. That is request.params.id and also owner. And owner is going to be request.user._ID. Perfect. So now we're finding the task by a way that takes the owner into account. Now right here, we're actually trying to update the task before we even know if it exists. All I'm going to do is take these two lines and move them below the if statement. So now we'll have that 404 print if no task is found, either because it doesn't exist by the ID or you're not the creator. So now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and test our work and make sure we can update our tasks and that we can't update someone else's tasks. So over in Postman, I'm logged in as that first user and I have a couple of tasks right here. I'm going to go ahead and grab the ID for the second one, go to Office, and I'm going to try to update it. So right here, I'll grab that ID. I'll head over to Update Task and paste that in the URL. Now here, I will switch up the completed value. So if I go back to read tasks, we can see it was false. It was not completed. Over here, I will adjust that over to true. I'm going to fire off the request. Down below, I get a 200 and I can see the updated task. Go to Office is now completed. From here, what I'm going to do is try to update a task that I did not create. So to do this, we could log in as that second user and grab one of those task IDs, or we could do that from over in the database, which is the approach I'll take. I'll go over to the tasks collection and refresh things. And here, the second two, those belong to the other user. So I'm going to right-click one of them and edit it, just so I can copy its ID to the clipboard. Here we have the task that Mike created, find a new job. Once I have that ID, I can head back over to Postman and paste it in up above. Now I'm still logged in as that first user. I should not be able to update this task. Down below, I fire that off, and what do I get? I get a 404 showing up, which is fantastic. So now, all of the routes are converted except for the final one, which is the route for deleting a task by ID. Right here, this is going to be your second challenge for the video. So what are you going to do? You're going to do the same sort of thing we've done 3 times already. You're going to add authentication. You're going to make sure that when you delete the task, you're taking the owner onto account as well. Right here, we have find one and delete, which can allow you to get that done, similar to how we used find one up above. Then you're going to test your work. Try to delete a task that you've created. It should work. Then try to delete a task created by another user, and that should fail. Take some time to knock this out, test your work, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's go ahead and kick things off by adding authentication into the mix. I'm going to get that done right here by setting up the auth middleware. Then down below, we have to update how we are finding the task. This approach is no longer going to work, as it only takes the task ID into account. Instead, we want to take task ID and the owner value. So const task equals, I'll use await with task dot find one and delete, which is very similar to find by ID and delete, though we can provide an object like we do with find one to specify the criteria we're using for searching. Here, the underscore ID field needs to have the following value, which comes from request.params.id, and the owner needs to line up with the ID of the authenticated user. request.user._ID. Perfect. That's all we had to do in order to get this done. So let's go ahead and remove the other line. We will remove the challenge comments, save the program, and now we're going to test things out. Now over here, I already have an ID of a task that I did not create. I used that to make sure that updating failed. I'm going to start by making sure deleting fails since I already have this ID available. So over here, for delete task, I will try to delete the task that I also could not update. It should not work here either. I'll fire that off, and what do I get? I get a 404. Now if I head back over to read tasks, I can see the tasks that I do have control over, and I'm going to delete the second one by its ID. So I'll copy the ID to the clipboard, head over to delete task, and from here, we're just going to paste it up top. I fire this off, and this time it should work, and right here it did. I have a 200, and I can see the deleted task. If I were to request all of my tasks again, I would expect to just have one, and that is exactly what I get. I no longer have to go to the office, but I still have to finish this Node course. So with this in place, all of the task routes, they require authentication, and they also take that into account when it comes to the relationship between you, the authenticated user, and the task you're trying to work with. When you create a task, it's associated with your user, and whenever you try to read a task, update a task, or delete a task, we make sure it's a task that you actually created. All right, with this in place, there's only one more thing I want to cover in this section, and that is coming up next. We're going to talk about how we can delete the tasks for a user who's deleted themselves. So if I close down my user profile, I would expect all of my tasks to go away as well. We'll knock that out coming up next.